The courtroom was thick with tension before the judge even entered. The air inside seemed heavier than the morning humidity blanketing Charleston's historic district just beyond the windows. Murmured conversations died down as the bailiff called the court to order. All eyes shifted forward, but not everyone knew why they were really there. Some had come to watch what they thought would be an open and shut case, another black woman on trial for resisting arrest. But no one knew what was about to unfold. No one knew the storm that was quietly seated at the defendant's table, waiting for the right moment to shatter every lie with truth. Camille Rivers sat upright, hands calmly folded, her expression unreadable. Her dark brown skin gleamed softly under the fluorescent lights, and her closely cropped curls framed a face that was impossible to look away from. Not because it demanded attention, but because it refused to be shaken. To the average onlooker, she was just another woman of color caught in the system, being prosecuted by a police officer whose version of the story came pre-packaged with credibility. But there was something else beneath the surface, a stillness too practiced to be accidental, a composure that bordered on military precision. She wasn't just here to defend herself. She was here to dismantle something much larger. The prosecutor adjusted his cuffs with casual confidence, preparing to present a narrative that had already been rehearsed. Officer Mark Linton, white, well-decorated, and respected by the local department, had claimed that Camille grew hostile and aggressive during a late-night encounter outside a downtown business. He alleged that she refused to show ID, raised her voice, and then, in a moment of chaos, tried to reach for his weapon. He insisted it was all captured by his bodycam, until, of course, the footage was mysteriously corrupted. A coincidence, he claimed. The case looked clean on paper. But it wasn't. And Camille knew it. She had known it the moment Linton laid hands on her, twisting her wrist behind her back with force that wasn't necessary. Eyes cold with something more than suspicion. She had felt the sharp sting of humiliation when she was shoved against the patrol car, told to shut up and stop resisting, when she had done nothing but ask calmly why she was being detained. And worst of all, she had seen the flicker in his eyes when he assumed he could get away with it. When he believed no one would question his account. He hadn't recognized her. Not as a decorated officer, not as a war veteran, not as a human being. The irony was brutal. Camille Rivers had led classified missions in foreign deserts and sailed into hostile waters under fire. She had cleared villages, extracted civilians, and been the one voice of steadiness in chaos. She had buried teammates. She had worn the uniform of a Navy SEAL, one of the few black women to ever do so, and she had done it without fanfare. Quietly, relentlessly. But to Officer Linton, she was just another black woman causing trouble. And that was the mistake that would unravel everything. When the judge finally entered, a weathered man in his 60s with a furrowed brow and an aversion to courtroom drama, the air shifted. Judge Ronald Mercer had presided over his fair share of racially charged cases in South Carolina. But something about the way Camille sat caught his attention. She wasn't pleading, she wasn't posturing, she was waiting, and that made him curious. State of South Carolina versus Camille Rivers, the bailiff announced. Camille rose, and for a brief moment, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath. She moved with precision, not theatrical, but intentional. Officer Linton watched her, his expression neutral, but his shoulders a little too straight, his jaw clenched just enough to betray unease. He wasn't expecting a fight. He had expected fear or shame. What he got instead was presence, unshakable, unbothered. The prosecutor launched into opening remarks with practiced ease, painting Camille as uncooperative, unpredictable, and potentially dangerous. "My client," he said, gesturing to Linton, feared for his safety in an escalating situation. Camille didn't flinch. She didn't even blink. Because she had faced real danger before. In places where bullets didn't hesitate and hesitation could cost you your life. She had stood in the face of insurgents and insurgent assumptions. And somehow, this courtroom, this insult to her dignity dressed as a trial, felt heavier. Because it wasn't about war. It was about identity. It was about the unbearable weight of being unseen in your own country. When Officer Linton took the stand, he spoke confidently. She was combative, he claimed, aggressive, belligerent. He emphasized her refusal to produce ID and leaned heavily on the idea that her behavior suggested she might be under the influence. The prosecutor nodded along, while the jury scribbled notes, and the gallery listened with passive absorption. But Camille watched his every move, the subtle twitch in his right hand, the forced inflection in his voice. She could see it, the lie. It wasn't blatant. It didn't need to be. It was just believable enough for those who wanted to believe it. And that was the most dangerous kind of lie. When he stepped down, satisfied with his performance, the judge turned to Camille. "Miss Rivers," he said, voice steady but measured, "are you ready to testify?" She nodded once, and as she rose to take the stand, the air changed again. Her steps were measured, grounded. The jury leaned in slightly. The gallery grew still. She adjusted the microphone with deliberate grace. And then she looked Officer Linton in the eye for the first time. "I'm ready," she said. And though the courtroom didn't yet know it, that was the moment the story began to turn. Because the truth, her truth, wasn't just coming. It was about to hit like a thunderclap. And no one in that room was prepared for the storm Camille Rivers was about to bring. As Camille Rivers adjusted the microphone and looked into the rows of jurors ahead, she felt an unexpected calm ripple through her chest. Not the kind of peace born from safety, but the kind that comes when you finally stop hiding. The kind that demands truth be spoken, no matter the cost. Her voice was steady, even as the courtroom leaned in, waiting for her side of the story. "On the night in question," she began, "I was returning home from dinner with a colleague, someone I served with, actually. I'd parked downtown near the marina and was checking my GPS to avoid a construction detour." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "I wasn't trespassing. I wasn't breaking any laws. I wasn't even standing in the street. I was just there." A soft murmur swept the gallery. Just a ripple. Camille heard it but didn't acknowledge it. She didn't speak for them. She spoke for the record, for the jury, and for every person who had ever been treated as a threat for simply existing in public space. "When Officer Linton pulled up," she continued, "he didn't ask if I needed help. He didn't greet me. He didn't even tell me why I was being approached. He shined his flashlight directly in my eyes and said, 'You don't belong here this time of night.'" Gasps echoed faintly across the room. The prosecutor sat forward slightly, but Camille didn't stop. Her voice never rose. It didn't need to. "I asked him if something was wrong. He told me not to get smart. When he asked for ID, I asked, politely, if I had done something to warrant being stopped. That's when his tone changed." Judge Mercer looked down at his notes, expression tight. Camille saw him grip his pen a little harder. "He told me, 'People like you think they don't have to listen.'" Then he grabbed my wrist. She held up her right hand, rotating it slowly. "There was bruising here. My physician took photos. I didn't fight. I didn't resist. But I did say one thing." She turned her head slightly, eyes finding Officer Linton seated behind the prosecution table. "I said, 'You're making a mistake.'" Benjamin Carter, seated at the defense table, barely breathed. His notes were untouched. He had heard Camille recount the incident in fragments before, but never like this. Never with this level of composure, fire, and focus all wrapped into one. "The next thing I knew," Camille said, "he had shoved me against the hood of his cruiser, twisted my arm behind my back, and said I was under arrest for obstruction and resisting. I hadn't moved an inch." The prosecutor rose. "Objection, Your Honor. The witness is editorializing." Judge Mercer shook his head. "Overruled. Let her continue." Camille looked back at the jury. "He accused me of reaching for his weapon. I never did. He said I raised my voice. I didn't. He claimed his body cam failed. It didn't. The truth is, he didn't expect to be questioned. He didn't expect someone like me to push back." A few members of the jury exchanged glances, their skepticism giving way to curiosity. The prosecutor stood again, this time more forcefully. "Miss Rivers, do you have any proof of what you're claiming? Your word is compelling, but we need evidence." Camille smiled faintly, but it wasn't smug. It was restrained power. She turned to Judge Mercer. Your Honor, I request permission to introduce additional documentation regarding my background and qualifications. I believe the court deserves to know who I am, not just what I'm accused of. The judge studied her for a moment, clearly trying to understand the direction she was heading. Then he gave a small nod. Proceed. Benjamin rose, walking toward the evidence bench. From his case file, he removed a single sealed folder, handing it to the court clerk. The prosecutor crossed his arms, watching with skepticism. As the clerk distributed the copies to the judge and the jury, a wave of silence filled the room. Camille took a deep breath. My name is Lieutenant Commander Camille Rivers. I served 22 years in the United States Navy. 13 of those years were in a classified SEAL unit. I've completed over a dozen combat deployments, earned 2 Bronze Stars, and led intelligence-gathering missions across 5 continents. I've stood in the line of fire. I've rescued civilians from bombed-out buildings. I've trained soldiers in conflict zones and de-escalated life-or-death scenarios in real time. She leaned forward. But on a quiet street in Charleston, none of that mattered. Because all Officer Linton saw was a black woman in a hoodie. And to him, that was enough. The courtroom sat in stunned silence. Not even a whisper passed. Camille turned to the jury. I'm not asking you to believe me because of my rank. I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking you to understand that people like Officer Linton assume too much and ask too little. They see a threat where there is none. They make assumptions that turn into actions, actions that have consequences. The prosecutor was frozen, clearly uncertain how to challenge a narrative this solid, this human. Camille's voice dropped into something more intimate now. This case isn't about me being a Navy SEAL. It's about the fact that I shouldn't have to be one to be treated with respect. No one should. I want to live in a country where my background doesn't have to be revealed in a courtroom just to prove I'm not dangerous. She sat back slowly, folding her hands. Her gaze was steady, her breath even. Judge Mercer cleared his throat, his voice tight. The court will adjourn for today. We reconvene tomorrow morning. As the gavel struck and the room buzzed to life with murmurs and movement, Camille stood and walked past Officer Linton without so much as a glance. He sat frozen, eyes locked on the table, as though still trying to process what he had just heard. Benjamin followed her out into the hallway. You weren't just calm in there, he said quietly. You were devastating. Camille turned, the edges of her mouth curling in the barest of smiles. I haven't even started. The courthouse was quieter than usual the next morning. The media frenzy that had exploded overnight had drawn a ring of reporters and protesters to the steps outside. But inside, the air was thick with a different kind of tension. One that had less to do with spectacle and more to do with reckoning. What had begun as a straightforward assault and resisting arrest case had become a mirror held up to an entire system. And at its center stood a woman who was never supposed to be underestimated. Camille Rivers sat across from Benjamin Carter in the small consultation room tucked behind the defense chamber. A fluorescent light buzzed quietly above them, the only sound aside from the shuffle of documents and Benjamin's occasional pen tap. She cracked the room open yesterday, Benjamin said, tapping the folder in front of him. But now we need to blow the walls down. This next move, it's everything. Camille's eyes were calm, but there was an unmistakable intensity in her voice. We have to connect the dots, Ben. This can't just be about me anymore. They have to see that Linton's behavior isn't an isolated mistake. It's a pattern. Benjamin nodded slowly. The personnel records we subpoenaed are coming in today. If they show what we think they will, it changes the scope entirely. She leaned back, her gaze lifting toward the narrow window where the morning sun filtered in through dusty blinds. There were always guys like him overseas, men who used power as a weapon, not a responsibility, but they wore enemy flags. This is home. The moment lingered, quiet but not empty. An hour later, the documents arrived. Benjamin's hands trembled slightly as he opened the manila envelope, and Camille, seated across from him, said nothing, just watched. Page after page revealed complaints filed against Officer Linton. Excessive force, racial profiling, verbal abuse. Most had been quietly closed with phrases like, lack of sufficient evidence, or internal resolution reached. One stood out, a report filed by another officer, a Latina rookie who had quit the force 3 months later. Her handwritten statement was clipped to the back of the file. The final line read, "I didn't sign up to watch people be treated like this." Benjamin looked up, his face pale. "We've got him. Not just for what he did to you, but for who he's always been." Camille exhaled. Then it's time the court sees the whole picture. Back in the courtroom that afternoon, the atmosphere was electric. The seats were full now, not just of journalists and locals, but legal observers and civil rights advocates. Even the judge seemed more alert, his eyes narrowing as he took his place behind the bench. The weight of what was unfolding wasn't lost on anyone. Benjamin stood, his voice clear. "Your Honor, the defense respectfully requests to submit into evidence the disciplinary history of Officer Brent Linton, including a series of documented complaints made by both civilians and fellow officers." The prosecutor was on his feet instantly. "Objection, Your Honor. This is a character attack, irrelevant to the facts of the case." Judge Mercer didn't flinch. "Overruled. If this information is credible and connected to the defendant's claims, the jury has a right to see it." Benjamin walked the court through the records methodically. No theatrics, no exaggeration. Just fact after damning fact. At first, Linton tried to hold his composure, jaw clenched, eyes fixed ahead. But as Benjamin read the statement from the former officer, detailing how Linton had bragged about putting people in their place, a noticeable twitch rippled through his posture. Camille remained quiet, her presence as commanding in stillness as it was in speech. Every document revealed not just misconduct, but a pattern of emboldened behavior made possible by silence. When Benjamin was done, the room had shifted. The jury looked different now, not just curious, but troubled. The kind of trouble that suggested their worldview was being shaken loose at the edges. The prosecutor attempted damage control, calling Linton back to the stand. But it was too late. His denials came across as rehearsed, even desperate. Every answer he gave seemed to pull him deeper into a pit he'd dug with his own hubris. "I don't recall that complaint. I must have been misquoted. That was investigated internally and found to be nothing." But the jury wasn't buying it anymore. Benjamin's cross-examination was sharp, but not cruel. He didn't need to shout. The evidence was loud enough. "Officer Linton," he said at one point, holding up the personnel file, "is there a reason why nearly every complaint against you involves a black or brown citizen?" Linton hesitated, flustered. "Coincidence?" "Coincidence?" Benjamin echoed. "Because from where the jury sits, it looks like a pattern." Silence followed. Camille watched Linton shrink in real time, not just from the bench, but from his illusion of control. She had seen it before. Men who thought the rules didn't apply to them until the weight of consequence caught up. After court adjourned for the day, Camille stepped outside into the now crowded courthouse plaza. Reporters swarmed with questions, microphones thrust toward her like weapons. But she didn't stop. She didn't flinch. She walked calmly to the edge of the marble steps, turned to face the cameras, and spoke with the clarity of someone who had faced far more dangerous arenas than this. "This case," she said, "was never just about me. It's about what happens when accountability is replaced by assumption, when silence is mistaken for safety, when power is given without question and used without restraint. What you're seeing isn't a collapse, it's a beginning." She didn't wait for applause. She didn't need it. Because Camille Rivers had just changed the entire tone of the trial, not through anger, but through truth. And truth, she knew, always finds its way out. By the time the courtroom recessed that day, the balance of power had shifted, and everyone could feel it. Officer Brent Linton, who had once walked the courthouse halls with unchecked authority, now seemed like a man haunted by the weight of his own past. He had entered the courtroom as the accuser, cloaked in the credibility of a uniform. But now, that uniform looked more like a costume, masking something deeply flawed. Back in the defense room, Camille sat with Benjamin Carter, the dim light casting long shadows across the table between them. Papers were strewn everywhere, evidence, transcripts, annotations, but neither of them reached for the documents. Not yet. What needed to be said now couldn't be found in print. "You changed something today," Benjamin said quietly, looking at her with a mixture of awe and gravity. "Not just in this courtroom. I don't think you even realize what you've done." Camille's eyes didn't leave the wall. She stared ahead, focused on nothing and everything all at once. "I didn't come here to be a symbol," she said. "I came here because I was tired. Tired of people like Linton weaponizing their authority. Tired of surviving when I should be living." Benjamin leaned forward, folding his hands. "That's exactly why it matters." The tension between personal exhaustion and public expectation hung in the air. Camille wasn't new to leadership. She had led combat teams in the most brutal corners of the world. But this was a different kind of battlefield. One where the enemy wore suits instead of fatigues and fought with perception instead of bullets. The next day in court was quieter, more solemn. Word had spread about her military rank, about the evidence against Linton, about the viral clip of her speaking on the courthouse steps. Some came to witness history. Others came to challenge it. But all eyes were on her. Benjamin opened the day with emotion. "Your Honor, the defense requests permission to call a final witness to speak not only to the credibility of the defendant, but to the larger cultural patterns that allowed this event to happen." The judge looked over his glasses. "Who is the witness?" "Rear Admiral Joseph Langley, U.S. Navy, retired." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The judge blinked. "Proceed." Langley was a tall man in his 70s, with a lean frame and piercing eyes that had clearly seen war and wisdom. When he entered the courtroom, even the most skeptical attendees straightened in their seats. "Admiral," Benjamin began, "you served with Camille Rivers. Tell the court what you know about her character." Langley didn't flinch. "Lieutenant Commander Rivers was one of the most disciplined, courageous, and strategically brilliant officers I ever had the privilege of serving with. I trusted her with lives, with missions the public will never know about. She has never raised her voice unnecessarily, never escalated without cause, and has shown restraint under circumstances most people can't even imagine." He turned to the jury. "So when she says Officer Linton abused his authority and fabricated a story, I don't need video footage to believe her. But now you have that too." His words landed with the weight of truth backed by lived experience. He didn't plead. He didn't argue. He simply stated what was known. As Langley stepped down, the prosecution's final attempts at damage control fell flat. They called no more witnesses. Linton was no longer a credible narrator, and the jury knew it. The emotional core of the case had changed. No longer was it about proving Camille's innocence. That had been done. Now it was about accountability, justice, dignity. During the lunch break, Camille stood alone outside the courthouse. She leaned against the iron railing, the breeze catching the edge of her blazer. A young black woman approached hesitantly, holding the hand of a wide-eyed little girl no older than 7. "Ms. Rivers?" the woman asked. Camille turned, the intensity in her eyes softening just a touch. I wanted to say thank you. For standing up there. For not letting them tear you down." Camille smiled gently. She bent down to the girl's eye level. "What's your name?" The girl looked up at her shyly. "Imani." "That's a powerful name," Camille said. "You know what it means?" The girl nodded. "Faith." "That's right," Camille said. "Never forget that." As they walked away, Benjamin stepped up beside her. "That happens every time we take a stand, doesn't it? Someone watches. Someone learns what's possible." Camille didn't answer. She didn't need to. She had always known her fight wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about restoring the balance between power and truth. That afternoon, Benjamin gave his closing argument. It wasn't showy. It didn't need to be. He spoke of facts, yes, but also of patterns, of silence, and of complicity. He reminded the jury that systems aren't broken by accident. They erode slowly, through repeated neglect and quiet fear. "When we fail to hold power accountable," he said, voice steady, "we invite injustice to become the norm. But not today, not this time." When the judge released the jury to deliberate, the room felt like it had exhaled collectively. Camille sat at the defense table, calm, centered. Not because she knew the verdict, but because she knew she had done what few would dare. Stand alone and speak truth to power. Outside, storm clouds gathered. Rain threatened, but hadn't yet fallen. It felt symbolic, as if the sky itself was holding its breath. Inside the deliberation room, 12 citizens were grappling not just with law, but with morality, with conscience, with truth. Camille didn't pace. She didn't fidget. She sat still. Because whether or not the system saw her that day, she had already seen herself. And that, she knew, was a power no verdict could take away. When the bailiff returned with the words, "The jury has reached a verdict," the entire courtroom leaned forward in a collective hush. The next moments would mark the difference between justice served and justice denied. But Camille Rivers had already proven something far greater than any verdict could deliver. That integrity doesn't depend on validation, and courage doesn't wait for permission. And what came next would shake the foundations of everything that courtroom had ever believed about power, truth, and who gets to define both. The room was silent, but the silence didn't feel still. It trembled with anticipation. 12 members of the jury returned to their seats, eyes weighted with the burden of judgment. The foreperson, a woman in her late 50s with lines of thought carved deep into her brow, stood with a single sheet of paper in her hand. Everyone in the courtroom seemed to hold their breath as the judge addressed her. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Mercer asked, his voice calm but sharpened by years of gravity. "Yes, Your Honor," the woman replied. Camille Rivers didn't shift in her seat. Her posture remained straight, her eyes forward. This wasn't the moment that defined her. It wasn't the uniform that made her strong, or the courtroom that would validate her truth. That had come long before. On battlefields, on lonely nights, in the silence of her integrity. She didn't need vindication. She needed change. The foreperson unfolded the verdict. In the case of the state of South Carolina versus Camille Rivers, we, the jury, find the defendant not guilty on all counts. A wave of gasps and murmurs rushed through the courtroom like a released tide. Benjamin Carter's hand gripped the table beside him, his jaw unclenching for the first time in days. He turned to Camille, but she hadn't moved. Not yet. And further, the foreperson continued. The jury unanimously recommends an immediate investigation into Officer Brent Linton's conduct and the protocols of the police department regarding body camera usage and procedural accountability. This time, the applause could not be contained. Even as the judge struck his gavel for order, the room pulsed with a rising force that felt bigger than any ruling. It felt like a collective reckoning. Linton sat frozen, his face devoid of the confidence he once wielded like a shield. His fellow officers, who once lined the courtroom in uniformed silence, now shifted in their seats, some staring down at the floor, others at Camille, no longer able to reconcile what they had believed with what had been revealed. Judge Mercer dismissed the jury, and then turned to Camille. His eyes were tired, but there was something else there now. Respect. Maybe even a hint of remorse. "Ms. Rivers," he said, "you are free to go. The court owes you not only an apology, but reflection." Camille stood, finally, with the quiet dignity that had carried her through every storm. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She simply nodded, as if to say, "This part is done. But the fight is far from over." Outside, the courthouse steps were flooded with reporters, microphones, and flashing cameras. But Camille didn't stop for them. She walked straight through the noise, straight through the questions, until she found a small patch of sun near the edge of the plaza. There, she paused, alone, for the first time in days. Benjamin caught up, breathless from dodging the chaos behind them. "Camille," he said, stepping beside her, "it's done. You won." She turned to him, her voice low. "No, Ben. I didn't win. The truth did. I just helped it get heard." He nodded, quietly moved. "So what now?" Camille looked out across the plaza. There were people gathered, some holding signs of support, others simply watching. In the crowd, she saw a teenage boy holding the hand of his younger sister, his eyes wide with wonder. She caught his gaze and nodded once. He smiled, and something unspoken passed between them. The recognition that today's verdict was not just justice for her, but a signpost for everyone who looked like her, spoke like her, moved through this country with one eye always watching for danger. "I want a meeting with the city council," she said to Benjamin, "and the chief of police." "To say what?" he asked. "To tell them what's broken," she replied, "and how to fix it." It didn't take long for change to ripple outward. Within weeks, the local police department announced a full review of body camera policies, use of force training, and community bias education. Officer Linton was suspended pending an internal investigation, one that would uncover prior complaints previously buried under bureaucracy and silence. Charges of misconduct and perjury followed, and while justice would take its slow, bureaucratic course, the message was already clear. The system had been shaken. And Camille Rivers had been the quake. She didn't return to military service. That chapter of her life had closed with honor. But she didn't retreat either. Instead, she began speaking, at schools, town halls, police academies, not with bitterness, but with clarity. She spoke about the cost of silence, the power of standing up, the need for systems to be challenged from the inside, not just from the podium. At one particularly packed event at Howard University, a student stood and asked, "What do you say to people who are afraid to speak up?" Camille thought for a long moment before answering. "I say courage isn't the absence of fear. It's what you do in spite of it. I was afraid when I stood in that courtroom. But I was more afraid of what would happen if I stayed quiet. Silence lets injustice grow roots. And once it does, it chokes everything around it." The room had gone quiet, the weight of her words settling into every seat. "Start small," she continued. "Start with one truth, one no, one refusal to back down. That's how it spreads. That's how it changes." Months later, when Officer Linton's trial made headlines, Camille didn't attend. She had no interest in watching him fall. Her work was elsewhere, building what would stand in place of what had broken. The community she once feared would abandon her now stood behind her. Her name, once buried under suspicion, now echoed in classrooms, city chambers, and conversations about reform. Not as a hero, but as a reminder. Camille Rivers didn't demand justice. She revealed it. And in doing so, she reminded a nation of something easy to forget in a world distracted by noise and appearance. That real strength doesn't shout. It simply stands. Camille Rivers' story is one that will echo long after courtroom doors close and headlines fade. It began as a disturbing encounter, a black woman wrongly accused, silenced, and nearly convicted by a system that was supposed to protect her. But what unfolded wasn't just a legal battle. It was a reckoning. Camille, a retired Navy SEAL who had spent 2 decades defending her country, found herself fighting a very different kind of war. One rooted not in foreign soil, but in prejudice and systemic bias right here at home. What made Camille's story extraordinary wasn't just the injustice she faced. It was how she chose to face it. She didn't scream for revenge. She didn't crumble under the weight of slander. She rose. With discipline, calm, and a conviction forged through years of service, she turned the narrative on its head. Her silence wasn't submission. It was strategy. Her restraint wasn't weakness. It was strength. And when she finally spoke, her truth didn't just defend her. It dismantled lies, exposed corruption, and sparked change. In a world where too many voices are ignored and too many stories are rewritten to fit comfortable narratives, Camille refused to be erased. She reminded us that real power lies not in shouting the loudest, but in standing with unshakable purpose. Her case led to policy reviews, disciplinary actions, and a shift in public consciousness. But perhaps more importantly, it reminded every single person watching that silence does not mean consent, and dignity cannot be dictated by status or uniform. The lesson from Camille's journey is both simple and profound. Courage isn't always loud. Sometimes it looks like restraint. Sometimes it means standing alone. And sometimes it means trusting that truth, no matter how buried, will find its way to the surface if you're willing to carry it. So how do we apply this to our own lives? We start by paying attention. We listen when someone says they've been wronged. We question systems that allow inequality to hide behind procedure. We use our platforms, however big or small, to speak truth with clarity, not anger. And most importantly, we refuse to accept that the way it's always been is the way it has to stay. Camille Rivers showed us that one person's refusal to be silenced can shake an entire system. Now it's our turn to carry that torch. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you think differently, consider subscribing to this channel. Your support helps us keep sharing powerful stories like Camille's, real stories that challenge the status quo and honor those brave enough to demand better. Let's keep uncovering truth, celebrating courage, and building a future where justice is more than a word, it's a lived reality. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned for the next powerful journey.